Montana Territory, 1875. The unforgiving frontier stretched before Vincent Mackenzie like a cruel mistress, beautiful and deadly all at once. The distant Bitterroot Mountains cut a jagged silhouette against the fading daylight as he guided his chestnut mare across the vast prairie. At 25, Vincent had already seen enough violence to last several lifetimes. The Civil War had stolen his youth, and the lawless frontier had hardened whatever innocence remained. "No point in getting attached to anything out here, Starlight," he murmured to his horse, patting her sleek neck. "The West takes everything eventually." Vincent had built his existence around this truth. Love was a luxury afforded to those in safe Eastern parlors, not men who lived by the gun and saddle. The frontier demanded survival above all else, and Vincent had learned that lesson through blood and loss. His father, once a proud rancher, had died defending their small Texas homestead from raiders. His mother had succumbed to fever shortly after. At 17, Vincent had buried them both before riding north with nothing but his father's Colt revolver and a heart sealed tight against further pain. Now, 8 years later, he had earned a reputation as one of the most capable cowboys in the territory. The Double Creek Ranch paid him well for his skills with cattle and horses. He kept to himself, did his job with quiet competence, and ignored the occasional loneliness that crept in during long nights under the stars. His fellow ranch hands respected his privacy and his skill, though few could claim to know the man behind the stoic facade. As twilight deepened, Vincent spotted the flickering lights of Clearwater, the small settlement that served the surrounding ranches. He wasn't particularly eager to reach town, but supplies were running low, and the ranch owner had asked him to deliver several important letters to the postmaster. The main street of Clearwater was relatively quiet as Vincent dismounted and secured Starlight outside the general store. A handful of cowboys lounged outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, and a few townspeople hurried about their evening errands. Vincent nodded politely to Mrs. Peterson as she exited the store, her arms laden with parcels. "Evening, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "Vincent Mackenzie, as I live and breathe. When are you going to let me introduce you to my niece? She's arriving next month, and a handsome young man like you shouldn't be alone." Vincent managed a polite smile. "I appreciate the thought, Mrs. Peterson, but I'm afraid I wouldn't be good company." The older woman clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "Nonsense, you're a fine young man, too serious by half, but that can be fixed with the right woman." Vincent was spared further matchmaking by the arrival of the evening stagecoach, its wheels kicking up dust as it rolled to a stop before the town's small hotel. The commotion provided the perfect distraction, and he slipped inside the general store with relief. The familiar sense of coffee, leather, and tobacco greeted him as he approached the counter. "Evening, Mr. Thompson. I need the usual supplies for the Double Creek, and I have these to post." He placed the ranch owner's letters on the counter. The storekeeper nodded amiably. "I'll get your order together, Vincent. Might take a bit longer than usual, though. Just got a big shipment in this morning that needs sorting." Vincent nodded. "No hurry, I can wait." As Thompson disappeared into the storeroom, the bell above the door jingled. Vincent turned casually, then froze. The young woman who entered moved with quiet grace, her deep blue traveling dress dusty from the road. She couldn't have been more than 20, with honey blonde hair pinned partially beneath a modest bonnet, allowing soft curls to frame a face that struck Vincent with its quiet beauty. She wasn't flashy or bold like the saloon girls, but something about her clear green eyes and determined expression caught his attention in a way that left him momentarily disoriented. She approached the counter, seemingly unaware of his scrutiny. "Excuse me," she called toward the storeroom, "is anyone available?" Vincent cleared his throat. "Mr. Thompson is in the back, miss. He'll be out shortly." She turned, noticing him fully for the first time. A flicker of something wariness perhaps passed through her eyes before she offered a small, polite smile. "Thank you. I just arrived on the stagecoach and need directions." Vincent nodded, attempting to reclaim his usual composure. "Are you visiting family in Clearwater?" "No, she hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "I'm the new schoolteacher. My name is Abigail Hayes." "Vincent Mackenzie," he replied, touching the brim of his hat. "I work at the Double Creek Ranch." "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Mackenzie." Her voice carried a slight Eastern accent, confirming what her refined manners had already suggested. She was clearly out of place in this rough frontier town. An unexpected protective instinct stirred within Vincent. The West was no place for delicate Eastern women, especially one as young as Miss Hayes. Clearwater wasn't the worst settlement in the territory, but it had its share of unsavory characters. A woman alone would face countless challenges. The schoolhouse is at the far end of town, past the church, Vincent offered, but it's been empty for some time. Last teacher left almost a year ago. Abigail's expression tightened slightly. Yes, I was informed. The town council assured me the building has been prepared for my arrival. Vincent doubted the council's definition of prepared would match an Eastern lady's expectations, but he kept that thought to himself. It's nearly dark. Would you like me to show you the way? Something in her expression shifted, a guard going up. That's kind of you, Mr. Mackenzie, but I'm sure I can manage. I believe the hotel proprietor has arranged for someone to escort me. Before Vincent could respond, Mr. Thompson emerged from the storeroom. Ah, you must be our new schoolteacher. Welcome to Clearwater, Miss Hayes. As the storekeeper fussed over the newcomer, Vincent gathered his thoughts. The woman's arrival shouldn't concern him. Schoolteachers came and went in frontier towns, most lasting only a season before the hardships sent them scurrying back east. She would be no different. Yet as Vincent collected his supplies and headed back to his horse, he found himself glancing over his shoulder at the general store, where Abigail Hayes was still visible through the window. There was something about her, a determined set to her jaw that belied her delicate appearance, that suggested she might be more resilient than most. Not your concern, Mackenzie, he muttered to himself as he secured his supplies to Starlight's saddle. The last thing he needed was to worry about some eastern schoolmarm who'd likely be gone before the first snow. But as he rode back toward the double creek in the gathering darkness, Vincent couldn't quite shake the image of those clear green eyes from his mind. Abigail Hayes stared at the small, weathered building that was to be her home and workplace for the foreseeable future. In the pale morning light, the Clearwater schoolhouse looked even more dilapidated than it had when she'd first viewed it the previous evening. The clapboard siding needed paint, one window was cracked, and the steps to the small porch sagged alarmingly. Well, she whispered to herself, it's certainly not Boston. She squared her shoulders and unlocked the door with the heavy iron key the town council chairman had provided. The interior smelled of dust and abandonment. A dozen rough-hewn desks faced a larger teacher's desk. A pot-bellied stove stood cold in one corner. A narrow staircase led to what she presumed was her living quarters above. Abigail set down her carpetbag and removed her bonnet, taking a deep breath. At 20 years old, she had traveled over 2,000 miles to reach this remote settlement, leaving behind everything familiar. The journey had been long and often frightening, but necessity had driven her forward. Montana Territory offered what Boston could not: anonymity and a fresh start. This will do just fine, she announced to the empty room, as if saying it aloud might make it true. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the window. A wagon was pulling up outside, driven by a kindly-looking older woman she recognized from the previous evening as Mrs. Peterson, the seamstress. Miss Hayes. I thought you might need some assistance getting settled, the woman called cheerfully as she climbed down from the wagon seat with surprising agility for her age. I've brought some cleaning supplies and a few necessities to tide you over. That's very kind, Mrs. Peterson. I'm grateful for the help, Abigail replied, hurrying out to assist with the parcels. It's nothing, dear. We're all thrilled to have a teacher again. The children have been running wild for months. Together they carried the supplies inside, Mrs. Peterson tusked disapprovingly at the state of the place. Gracious, those council men wouldn't know prepared if it bit them on the nose. Don't you worry, though, we'll have this place shipshape in no time. For the next several hours, Abigail and Mrs. Peterson swept, scrubbed, and organized. The older woman's cheerful chatter was a welcome distraction from the enormity of what Abigail had undertaken. How many students should I expect? Abigail asked as they paused for tea at midday. About 15, ranging from 6 to 16. Most are ranchers' children with a few from town. Good children mostly, though the Hawkins boys can be a handful. Mrs. Peterson poured tea into mismatched cups. What brings a refined young lady like yourself all the way from Boston to our little corner of the world, if you don't mind my asking? Abigail had prepared for this inevitable question. I wanted adventure, she said, the practiced lie coming easily now, and the opportunity to make a difference. There aren't many teaching positions for women back east that don't require connections I don't have. Mrs. Peterson studied her over the rim of her teacup. Well, you'll certainly find adventure here, though I hope you're prepared for the challenges of frontier life. Winters are harsh and comforts are few. I'm stronger than I look, Abigail replied with a small smile. I believe you are, Mrs. Peterson patted her hand. Now let's check those upstairs rooms. The living quarters proved to be Spartan but serviceable, a small bedroom, a sitting area with a fireplace and a tiny kitchen space. By late afternoon, the schoolhouse was as clean as elbow grease could make it, though still plain and somewhat shabby. That's a vast improvement, Abigail said, surveying their work. I can't thank you enough, Mrs. Peterson. It was my pleasure, dear. Oh, I almost forgot. The older woman hurried to the wagon and returned with a large basket. Some food to get you started. My husband will deliver a cord of firewood tomorrow. You're too kind, Abigail said, genuinely touched by the woman's generosity. Nonsense, we look after our own in Clearwater. Mrs. Peterson hesitated, then added, I should warn you there may be some resistance. Not everyone believes educating girls beyond basic letters is necessary, and some of the ranchers see schooling as a distraction from chores. I've encountered such attitudes before, Abigail replied calmly. I'll manage. After Mrs. Peterson departed, promising to return the next day with more supplies, Abigail slowly climbed the stairs to her new quarters. Exhaustion settled over her like a heavy blanket as she sank onto the narrow bed. She pulled a locket from beneath the high collar of her dress and clicked it open, revealing a tiny portrait of a solemn-faced infant. I'm doing this for you, she whispered to the image, for both of us. Abigail had left more than Boston behind. She had left scandal, shame, and the suffocating weight of societal judgment. Here, 2,000 miles from those who knew her story, she could be simply Miss Hayes, the schoolteacher, not Abigail Hayes, the fallen woman with a secret that would destroy her if discovered. As darkness fell over the frontier town, Abigail closed the locket and tucked it away. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight, she had achieved the first step in her plan. Establishing herself in a place where no one knew her past, she only hoped it would remain that way. The following week brought steady rain to the Montana Territory, turning the dirt streets of Clearwater to mud and keeping Vincent at the Double Creek longer than planned. By the time the weather cleared, the cattle needed attention more urgently than his desire for supplies, and it was nearly 2 weeks before he found himself riding back toward town. He'd thought little of the new schoolteacher in the intervening days, aside from occasional wondering whether she'd already given up and returned east. He was surprised, therefore, to hear from one of the hands that not only was Miss Hayes still in Clearwater, but she had apparently made quite an impression. Got my sister's boy reading already, young Tom Jenkins had reported during a dinner break. Been trying for years, but Miss Hayes figured out some special way to help him. Real patient she is. Vincent had merely nodded, though he found himself curious about the Eastern woman who was defying his expectations. When he rode into town that Saturday morning, the schoolhouse caught his attention immediately. The building, while still humble, had been transformed. Fresh white paint covered the clapboard siding, the broken window had been repaired, and bright curtains hung in the windows. A small vegetable garden had been started alongside the building, and flowers bloomed in boxes beneath the windows. Even more surprising was the sound of music floating through the open windows, a clear, sweet voice accompanied by what sounded like a small pump organ. Vincent slowed Starlight to a walk, drawn despite himself toward the schoolhouse. Children's voices joined the woman's, somewhat less melodious but enthusiastic. He dismounted and approached quietly, not wanting to disturb whatever lesson was in progress. Through the open door he could see about a dozen children seated on benches, singing from small hymnals. At the front of the room, Abigail Hayes sat at a small organ, her honey-blonde hair neatly pinned up, wearing a simple blue dress with white collar. The sunlight streaming through the windows created a halo effect around her as she played, her expression one of genuine joy. The scene struck Vincent with unexpected force, this small pocket of civilization and culture in the midst of the harsh territory. It had been years since he'd heard music other than rough trail songs or drunken saloon tunes. The pure notes of the hymn transported him momentarily to his childhood, before violence and loss had reshaped his world. The song ended and Abigail turned to her students with a bright smile. Very good, now remember to practice for Sunday. Reverend Thompson has asked us to perform during the service. A young girl raised her hand. Miss Hayes, will you play your special song for us before we go, the one about the nightingale? Abigail's smile faltered slightly. Not today, Emma. It's nearly noon and I'm sure your parents are expecting you home for lunch. As the children gathered their things, Abigail noticed Vincent standing in the doorway. A flicker of something recognition, wariness, crossed her features before she composed herself. "Mr. Mackenzie, isn't it?" she asked, rising from the organ bench. "What brings you to the schoolhouse?" Vincent suddenly felt foolish, standing there without purpose. "I was passing by and heard the music," he admitted. "I haven't heard a proper organ in years." The children filed past him with curious glances and whispered comments. When the last had departed, Abigail approached, maintaining a proper distance. "Do you play, Mr. Mackenzie?" she asked, gesturing to the organ. "No, ma'am. My mother tried to teach me as a boy, but I never had the patience." The admission surprised him. He rarely spoke of his past. "Music requires discipline," she agreed, "but it brings such comfort, especially out here where beauty can sometimes seem scarce." Vincent glanced around the transformed schoolroom, noting the maps on the walls, the neat rows of books, the vase of wildflowers on her desk. "You've done a remarkable job with the place." "Thank you, the community has been very supportive." She tilted her head slightly. "Have you been in Montana Territory long, Mr. Mackenzie?" "About 3 years. Before that, Texas and a few other places." She nodded, seemingly unsurprised by his reticence. "And do you enjoy ranch work?" "It suits me," Vincent shifted, uncomfortable with personal questions. "I should let you get to your midday meal. I only stopped because of the music." "Of course," was that disappointment in her voice. "It was nice seeing you again, Mr. Mackenzie." Vincent nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "The children seem fond of you, Miss Hayes. Tom Jenkins says his nephew is reading already." A genuine smile lit her face. "Billy has a fine mind, he just needed a different approach than most children." "Well, it's good what you're doing," Vincent said awkwardly. "Clearwater needs stability for its young ones." Something in Abigail's expression shifted, becoming guarded. "I hope to provide that for as long as I'm needed here." As Vincent rode toward the general store, he found himself puzzling over the schoolteacher. She clearly wasn't the fragile Eastern flower he'd initially assumed. Anyone who could transform that dilapidated schoolhouse and win over the town's children so quickly possessed remarkable determination. Yet there was something about her, a wariness in her eyes, a careful distance she maintained that suggested secrets. Vincent recognized the signs because he carried his own closely guarded past. Out west, most people did. The frontier attracted those with something to escape or something to prove. Not that Abigail Hayes's secrets were any of his concern. Vincent reminded himself firmly that he had no interest in forming attachments in Clearwater. The schoolteacher would eventually realize that frontier life was too harsh and return to civilization, just as the teachers before her had done. Still, as he conducted his business in town, Vincent found his thoughts returning to the image of Abigail Hayes bathed in sunlight, coaxing music and learning from the rough-hewn frontier children. It was an image that stayed with him long after he'd returned to the isolation of the ranch. Summer progressed with relentless heat and occasional violent thunderstorms that rolled across the plains like divine retribution. Abigail settled into a routine at the schoolhouse, teaching during the week and spending her evenings preparing lessons or reading from her small collection of books. On weekends, she often assisted at church functions or visited the homes of students whose parents had invited her for Sunday dinner. She was careful to maintain proper distance and decorum with the townspeople, establishing herself as respectable but not becoming overly familiar with anyone. The role of dedicated, somewhat reserved schoolteacher suited her purposes perfectly. It allowed her to be part of the community while keeping certain aspects of herself private. Only in the quiet evenings, alone in her small quarters above the schoolhouse, did Abigail allow herself to contemplate the life she'd left behind. On those nights she would hold the locket, sometimes writing letters she would never send to the baby she would never see again. The wealthy Boston couple who had adopted her infant son had been clear: there would be no contact, no acknowledgement of her existence in the child's life. It was the price she paid for ensuring he would have opportunities and stability she couldn't provide. The scandal had been quietly managed by her parents, who had sent their unmarried, pregnant daughter to a home for fallen women in a distant city. After the birth, they had arranged her teaching credentials and suggested she seek a position far from Boston. The unspoken understanding was that she would not return. Abigail had complied, not out of obedience to her parents, but because she recognized that her son's future and her own depended on her ability to start anew. Montana Territory had seemed remote enough to escape her past. These thoughts occupied her one Saturday afternoon as she worked in her small garden behind the schoolhouse. The physical labor helped quiet her mind, and she found peace in nurturing the growing plants. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't notice the approaching rider until a shadow fell across her work. Looking up, Abigail was startled to see Vincent Mackenzie dismounting from his chestnut mare. In the month since their brief encounter at the schoolhouse, she had seen him only occasionally in town, always from a distance. He had made no effort to speak with her again, which suited her purposes of avoiding entanglements with the local men. "Miss Hayes," he greeted her, touching the brim of his hat. "I apologize for disturbing you." Abigail straightened, brushing soil from her hands. She had discarded her usual prim attire for a simpler work dress with sleeves rolled to the elbows, and she suddenly felt conscious of her disheveled appearance. "Mr. Mackenzie, this is unexpected." He shifted uncomfortably, looking somewhat out of place among her neat rows of vegetables. In the bright sunshine, Abigail noticed details she had missed in their previous encounters: a small scar above his right eyebrow, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the intensity of his blue eyes. "Mrs. Peterson asked me to deliver this," he finally said, extending a package wrapped in brown paper. "She mentioned it was a book you'd ordered." "Oh yes, thank you." Abigail accepted the package, curious about why the seamstress would send the ranch hand as a messenger, but unwilling to ask directly. Vincent glanced at her garden. "You've done well with this soil. Most newcomers struggle with growing anything in their first season." "My grandmother taught me gardening as a girl," Abigail replied. "Though the growing season here is different from New England." An awkward silence fell between them. Vincent seemed on the verge of departure when sudden shouting from the direction of town caught their attention. A rider was galloping down the main street, his voice carrying clearly in the still afternoon air. "Fire at the mill, all men needed, fire at the mill." Vincent tensed immediately. "I need to help." The mill's the heart of Clearwater's economy. Without thinking, Abigail said, "I'll come too. They may need assistance with the injured." Before Vincent could object, she was hurrying toward the schoolhouse. "Just let me get my medical supplies." Minutes later, they were both on Starlight, Vincent in the saddle and Abigail perched behind him, one arm holding a basket of bandages and salves, the other awkwardly maintaining a proper distance from his waist. The impropriety of their position wasn't lost on her, but emergency overrode convention. As they approached the mill at the edge of town, the extent of the danger became clear. Flames licked the eastern wall of the large wooden structure, and black smoke billowed into the clear sky. Men formed a bucket brigade from the nearby creek, while others attempted to move lumber and finished goods from the unburned portion of the building. "Stay back," Vincent instructed as he helped Abigail dismount. "If anyone's hurt, they'll bring them to you, but don't go near the building. That roof could collapse any minute." Abigail nodded, watching as he immediately joined the bucket brigade. She scanned the crowd for anyone needing attention and spotted Mrs. Miller, the mill owner's wife, looking pale and distressed. "Mrs. Miller," Abigail called, hurrying over, "are you injured?" "No, but my husband's inside," the woman replied, her voice tight with fear. "He and young Charlie were in the office when the fire started." Abigail's stomach clenched. Charlie Miller was one of her students, a bright 10-year-old with a talent for mathematics. "How long ago?" "Just minutes before the alarm was raised. The men are trying to reach them, but the main entrance is blocked by flames." Abigail scanned the burning building, noting that the fire seemed concentrated on the eastern side. The office, if she recalled correctly, was toward the western corner. She remembered Charlie mentioning a window in his father's office that overlooked the creek. Without allowing herself time to reconsider, Abigail set down her basket and hurried around the side of the building, away from the bucket brigade. The west wall was still untouched by flames, though smoke had begun to seep through the wooden planks. She spotted the window, small but large enough for a child to fit through. "Mr. Miller," she called. "Charlie." "Can you hear me?" For a moment there was no response. Then faintly she heard a child's voice. "Miss Hayes, we're trapped, the door's too hot." "Charlie, is your father with you?" "Yes, but he hit his head when the shelf fell. He's awake but dizzy." Abigail's mind raced. "Listen carefully, Charlie. I need you to open the window and climb out. I'm right below it." "But what about Pa?" "We'll help him next, but you need to come first." After a moment's hesitation, the window scraped open, and Charlie's soot-streaked face appeared. The drop to the ground was about 7 feet, not far but potentially dangerous. I'm scared, Miss Hayes. I know, but you can do this. Sit on the windowsill, then turn around and lower yourself as far as you can before letting go. I'll be right here. The boy followed her instructions with remarkable composure. When he dropped, Abigail managed to break his fall enough to prevent injury, though they both ended up on the ground. Good job, Charlie, she said, helping him up. Now run to your mother by the creek. Tell the men your father is still inside. As Charlie ran off, Abigail turned back to the window. Mr. Miller, can you hear me? A weak cough answered her. Miss Hayes, Charlie get out all right? Yes, he's safe, now it's your turn. Can't legs trapped under the cabinet, and the smoke's getting worse. Abigail looked around desperately. The fire was spreading faster now, and she could feel the heat intensifying even on this side of the building. Making a swift decision, she found a sturdy crate, positioned it under the window, and climbed up. The window was barely large enough for her shoulders, but Abigail managed to squeeze through, falling rather ungracefully onto the office floor. Thick smoke immediately assaulted her lungs, and she pulled a handkerchief over her mouth and nose. Mr. Miller lay pinned beneath a heavy filing cabinet that had toppled over. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, and his face was ashen beneath the soot. Miss Hayes, you shouldn't have come in, he coughed. Too dangerous. Let's save the lectures for when we're both outside, Abigail replied, assessing the situation. The cabinet was too heavy for her to lift alone, but if she could shift it just enough. She searched the office and found a sturdy piece of lumber. Using it as a lever, she managed to lift the cabinet just enough for Mr. Miller to drag himself free. His right leg was clearly broken, the angle unnatural. Can you stand at all, she asked, not without help. Abigail positioned herself under his arm. Lean on me, we need to hurry. Together they shuffled toward the window. Outside she could hear shouting, the fire was advancing rapidly. You go first, Mr. Miller insisted. I'm too big for that window anyway. I'm not leaving you, Abigail replied firmly. There must be another way. Just then the office door burst open, and Vincent Mackenzie appeared through the smoke, a wet bandana covering the lower half of his face. Miss Hayes, his eyes widened in shock before narrowing in determination. This way, quickly, we've cleared a path through the side entrance, but it won't last long. With Vincent supporting most of Mr. Miller's weight, they made their way through the smoke-filled corridors. Twice they had to change course as flames blocked their path. Abigail's lungs burned and her eyes streamed with tears, but she kept moving forward, one hand clutching Mr. Miller's arm, the other following Vincent's jacket. When they finally burst into the open air, Abigail's legs gave way beneath her. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground, and she found herself being carried away from the burning building. Through smoke-blurred vision, she recognized Vincent's concerned face above her. That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever witnessed, he said as he set her down gently at a safe distance. Abigail couldn't answer through her coughing fit. Someone pressed a canteen to her lips and she gratefully swallowed the cool water. Miss Hayes saved my Charlie, Mrs. Miller was saying nearby, her voice thick with emotion, and then went back for my husband. We'll never forget this, never. When Abigail could finally speak, she looked up at Vincent, who hadn't left her side. Thank you for coming in after us. Something in his expression had changed, the usual guardedness replaced by a mix of concern and something else she couldn't quite identify. Why did you do it? He asked quietly. You could have been killed. Abigail met his gaze steadily. Charlie is my student. I couldn't stand by while he was in danger. There were a dozen men already trying to help. Men with experience fighting fires. And yet Charlie might have suffocated before they reached him. She coughed again, wincing at the pain in her raw throat. Vincent shook his head, but there was reluctant admiration in his eyes. You're not what I expected, Miss Hayes. Before Abigail could respond, the town doctor arrived to examine her and Mr. Miller. The mill owner's broken leg required immediate attention, and Abigail was instructed to rest and avoid smoke for several days. As she was helped to her feet to be escorted back to the schoolhouse, Abigail glanced back at Vincent, who stood watching her with an unreadable expression. Something had shifted between them, a mutual recognition, perhaps, that there was more to each of them than their carefully maintained exteriors suggested. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Abigail had come to Montana to escape her past and protect her secrets. The last thing she needed was someone looking too closely at who she really was, yet as Mrs. Peterson led her away, Abigail couldn't help looking back one last time at the tall cowboy silhouetted against the burning mill, wondering what secrets of his own he might be harboring. Word of Abigail's actions at the mill fire spread quickly through Clearwater and the surrounding ranches. By the following Sunday, when she returned to church for the first time since the incident, she found herself the recipient of numerous expressions of gratitude and admiration. Women pressed baked goods and preserves into her hands, while men tipped their hats with newfound respect. The attention made her deeply uncomfortable. Abigail had not rescued Charlie and his father to earn acclaim, but because it had been the right thing to do. Moreover, such prominence in the community was exactly what she had hoped to avoid. Scrutiny inevitably led to questions about her past, her family, her reasons for coming west. "You must join us for Sunday dinner, Miss Hayes," Mrs. Peterson insisted after the service. "My husband is eager to thank you properly for your bravery." Abigail hesitated but found no polite way to refuse. "That's very kind of you." "Excellent, and I've invited young Mr. Mackenzie as well. He was quite the hero himself, from what I hear." Abigail's pulse quickened. "Mr. Mackenzie from the Double Creek Ranch." "The very same. He doesn't often accept social invitations, but when I mentioned you would be there," Mrs. Peterson's eyes twinkled meaningfully. "I'm sure Mr. Mackenzie has better things to do than attend a dinner on my account," Abigail said carefully. "Nonsense, the man needs civilized company, works too hard and speaks too little if you ask me." Mrs. Peterson patted Abigail's hand. "Besides, after what you two went through together at the fire, I thought you might welcome the chance to thank him properly." Abigail managed a noncommittal smile, though inwardly she felt a growing unease. Vincent Mackenzie was observant and intelligent, qualities that made him potentially dangerous to her carefully constructed new identity. The less time she spent in his company, the better. Yet when she arrived at the Peterson home that afternoon, wearing her best dress of deep green wool, Abigail found herself scanning the small gathering for his familiar figure. She told herself it was merely caution, knowing where he was would help her avoid prolonged conversation. Vincent arrived shortly after she did, looking uncomfortable in clean clothes that somehow seemed too confining for his athletic frame. He had made an effort to tame his dark hair, though a few rebellious strands still curled at his collar. When their eyes met across the parlor, he gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. Throughout the meal, Abigail was careful to direct her conversation to Mrs. Peterson and the other guests, a local merchant and his wife. Vincent remained mostly silent, speaking only when directly addressed. Yet she was acutely aware of his gaze occasionally resting on her, thoughtful and assessing. After dessert, when Mr. Peterson suggested the men enjoy cigars on the porch, Vincent excused himself instead. "I appreciate the hospitality, but I should get back to the ranch before dark," he said. Mrs. Peterson protested. "Surely you can stay a bit longer. Perhaps Miss Hayes would enjoy seeing the garden before you go." The transparent matchmaking made Abigail flush with embarrassment. "I wouldn't want to delay Mr. Mackenzie if he needs to return to his duties." Vincent hesitated, then said, "A brief walk would be no imposition." With no graceful way to refuse, Abigail found herself strolling beside the tall cowboy through Mrs. Peterson's carefully tended garden. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the flower beds, and the air was sweet with the scent of late summer blooms. "Mrs. Peterson means well," Vincent said after they had walked in silence for several moments. "But she's determined to see every unattached person in Clearwater properly paired off." "I've noticed," Abigail replied with a small smile. "She's mentioned no fewer than 3 eligible bachelors since I arrived." "And yet you've shown no interest in any of them." It wasn't quite a question, but Abigail felt compelled to respond. "I came to Montana to teach, Mr. Mackenzie. Romance isn't part of my plans." He nodded, studying a nearby rosebush with apparent fascination. "A dedicated educator, the town is fortunate." "And what about you?" Abigail found herself asking. "Mrs. Peterson likely has a list of suitable young women for you as well." A shadow passed over his features. "I'm not looking for attachments either." They walked a few more paces in silence before Vincent spoke again. "Your throat sounds better." "After the fire, I mean." "Yes, thank you. The doctor's honey and whiskey remedy was effective, if somewhat potent." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I'm glad. What you did was remarkably brave, if foolhardy." "So you've said." Abigail paused beside a bench and sat down, suddenly weary of pretense. "Mr. Mackenzie, I sense you disapprove of my actions, yet you risked your own life in much the same way." Vincent remained standing, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. "I've faced fire before." "You hadn't." "Does experience make courage more valuable?" "Experience makes survival more likely." He met her gaze directly. "You could have died in that building, Miss Hayes." "The thought troubles me more than it should." The unexpected admission hung in the air between them. Abigail looked away first, unnerved by the intensity in his blue eyes. "I appreciate your concern," she said carefully. "But I made my choice and would make it again." Charlie needed help. "You're not what people in this town expect from an Eastern schoolteacher." Vincent's voice had softened. "They think they know you, but I suspect there's much more beneath the surface." Alarm bells rang in Abigail's mind. This was precisely the kind of perception she had feared. "I'm exactly what I appear to be, Mr. Mackenzie, a teacher who cares for her students." "And I'm just a simple cowhand," he replied, a hint of irony in his tone. "We all have our stories, Miss Hayes, some we share, others we keep close." Before Abigail could formulate a response, Mrs. Peterson's voice called from the house, breaking the tension. "Miss Hayes, Mr. Mackenzie, I've just brewed fresh coffee." Vincent offered his hand to help Abigail rise from the bench. She hesitated before accepting it, acutely aware of the warm strength in his grip and the calluses that spoke of years of hard labor. "Thank you for the conversation, Miss Hayes," he said formally as they walked back toward the house. "And for what it's worth, Clearwater is fortunate to have a teacher willing to risk herself for her students." Abigail nodded, unable to fully interpret the mix of emotions his words evoked. Gratitude for the acknowledgement, certainly, but also apprehension. Vincent Mackenzie saw too much, questioned too perceptively. If she weren't careful, those penetrating blue eyes might see through the careful facade she had constructed. As they rejoined the others, Abigail resolved to maintain a polite distance from the observant cowboy. Her new life in Montana depended on keeping her secrets buried, and Vincent Mackenzie seemed dangerously capable of unearthing them. Vincent hadn't planned to attend the Harvest Festival. Social gatherings had never been to his taste, and he'd successfully avoided most of Clearwater's community events during his 3 years in the territory. But when Mr. Thompson mentioned that the schoolchildren would be performing, and that their teacher had been working tirelessly to prepare them, Vincent found himself inexplicably changing his plans. Just for an hour, he told himself as he groomed Starlight with unusual care, to see how the town's doing after the mill fire. The Double Creek's foreman had raised an eyebrow when Vincent requested the evening off, but asked no questions. In the months since the fire, Vincent had become aware that his interest in Clearwater's schoolteacher had not gone unnoticed among his fellow ranch hands. He'd endured good-natured teasing with stoic silence, neither confirming nor denying the assumptions. The truth was more complicated than simple attraction, though Vincent couldn't deny Abigail Hayes had occupied his thoughts with increasing frequency. There was something about her, a contradiction between her proper Eastern manners and the fierce courage she displayed at the mill. She was like a puzzle with missing pieces, and Vincent had always been drawn to puzzles. The town square was transformed when he arrived, lanterns strung between buildings casting a warm glow over the festivities. Tables laden with food lined one side, while a platform had been constructed for musical performances and dancing. Nearly everyone in Clearwater and from the surrounding homesteads seemed to be in attendance, creating a buzz of conversation and laughter. Vincent dismounted and secured Starlight at the hitching post, straightening his best shirt and brushing dust from his trousers. He'd even polished his boots, an effort that now seemed foolish as he stepped into the muddy street. "Vincent Mackenzie, well, I never thought I'd see you at a social gathering," Mrs. Peterson exclaimed, materializing at his elbow. "Looking quite handsome too, I might add." Vincent touched the brim of his hat awkwardly. "Evening, ma'am." "Fine turnout for the festival." "Indeed, and wait until you hear the children sing. Miss Hayes has worked wonders with them." The older woman's eyes twinkled knowingly. "She's over by the schoolhouse gathering her students for their performance." Vincent nodded his thanks, trying to appear casual as he made his way through the crowd. He spotted Abigail immediately, surrounded by a dozen children in their Sunday best. She wore a dress he hadn't seen before, deep burgundy wool that complemented her honey blonde hair, which for once was styled more elaborately than her usual simple bun. The effect was striking, transforming her from the practical schoolteacher to an undeniably beautiful young woman. As if sensing his gaze, Abigail looked up. Surprise registered in her green eyes before she offered a polite smile and small nod of recognition. Vincent returned the gesture, suddenly uncertain why he had come or what he hoped to accomplish. Before he could consider approaching her, the mayor called for attention and announced the children's performance. Vincent found a spot at the edge of the crowd where he could observe without being too conspicuous. The children took their places on the platform, looking nervous but proud in their carefully pressed clothes. Abigail spoke quietly to them before taking her place at the small organ that had been moved from the schoolhouse for the occasion. When the music began, Vincent was transported. The children's voices, while untrained, carried simple harmonies with earnest enthusiasm. But it was Abigail who captured his attention completely. Her fingers moved deftly over the keys, and when she joined the singing for certain parts, her clear soprano lifted above the children's voices like a bird soaring over the prairie. Vincent hadn't heard such music since before the war. His mother had played piano, not with Abigail's skill perhaps, but with similar joy. The memory, long buried beneath years of hardship, surfaced unexpectedly, bringing with it an ache of loss and longing he'd thought long vanquished. The performance concluded to enthusiastic applause. The children beamed with pride as Abigail led them in a bow before releasing them to return to their parents. Vincent watched as she spoke with several townspeople, accepting their compliments with modest grace. "She's something special, isn't she?" a voice said beside him. Vincent turned to find Mr. Miller, the mill owner, standing nearby, his legs still splinted but healing well. "The children performed admirably," Vincent replied neutrally. Miller chuckled. "That's not what I meant, and you know it. Half the men in the county have set their caps for Miss Hayes, but she doesn't seem to notice. Or if she does, she doesn't care." Vincent frowned slightly. "Miss Hayes is focused on her teaching." "Aye, that she is. Dedicated to those children like they were her own." Miller glanced at Vincent shrewdly. "Though I've noticed she speaks more kindly of you than most other men who come calling." "We're barely acquainted," Vincent said, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "You both risked your lives in that fire, creates a bond, that does." Miller clapped Vincent on the shoulder. "Well, if you're not interested, there are plenty who are. That drummer from Helena's been mighty attentive tonight." Vincent followed Miller's gaze to where a well-dressed man in a city suit was offering Abigail a cup of cider. The stranger stood too close, his smile too familiar for a recent acquaintance. Something cold and sharp twisted in Vincent's chest at the sight. "Excuse me," he said to Miller, moving through the crowd before he could question his own motives. As he approached, Vincent caught the tail end of the stranger's conversation with Abigail. "Surely a lady of your refinement must miss the cultural advantages of Boston. Clearwater is charming, of course, but hardly the place for someone of your talents." Abigail's expression remained polite, but Vincent recognized the slight tension in her posture. "Clearwater has much to recommend it, Mr. Harrington. The children here deserve education as much as any in Boston." "Noble sentiment indeed," Harrington replied condescendingly. "But a temporary post, surely, a few years of frontier adventure before returning to civilization." "Miss Hayes," Vincent interrupted, touching his hat, "I believe you promised to explain the history project your students are preparing." Relief flashed in Abigail's eyes. "Mr. Mackenzie, yes, of course." She turned to the drummer. "If you'll excuse me, Mr. Harrington, duty calls." The man looked Vincent up and down with poorly disguised disdain. "Of course, perhaps we can continue our conversation later." As Harrington moved away, Abigail released a small sigh. "Thank you for the rescue. That's twice now you've come to my aid." "Seemed like you needed an escape," Vincent replied, offering his arm without thinking. "Would you care to walk? The conversation here is rather loud." To his surprise, she accepted, placing her gloved hand lightly on his forearm. They moved away from the center of festivities toward the quieter edge of the square. "I didn't expect to see you tonight," Abigail said after a moment. "Mrs. Peterson mentioned you rarely attend town gatherings." "I heard the children would be performing. Wanted to see the results of your teaching." A genuine smile lit her face. They worked so hard, most had never sung in harmony before. "You have a gift with them and your own voice," Vincent hesitated. "You sing beautifully." A shadow passed over her features. "Thank you, music has always been a comfort to me." She paused, then asked, "Did you enjoy the festival?" "More than I expected to," he admitted. Though I could do without the likes of Harrington. Abigail laughed softly. He's harmless if presumptuous. Traveling salesmen are all the same, they see the frontier as a temporary inconvenience between civilized posts. Is that how you see it? The question escaped before Vincent could consider its implications. She stopped walking, considering him thoughtfully. No, Clearwater is my home now, not a way station. The simple declaration settled something in Vincent's mind. I'm glad to hear it. They had reached the edge of the lantern light, the darkness of the prairie stretching before them. In the distance, heat lightning flashed silently, illuminating the vast landscape for brief moments. Beautiful, isn't it? Abigail murmured, gazing at the horizon. I never saw such skies in Boston, everything there felt, contained. The openness can be overwhelming at first, Vincent said. But after a while, anything else feels suffocating. She nodded, still watching the distant lightning. When I first arrived, I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. Everything was so harsh, so unforgiving. But now I can't imagine being anywhere else. Vincent studied her profile, softened by lamplight and night shadows. What brought you here, really? It wasn't just adventure. Abigail stiffened slightly. What makes you say that? You're running from something, I recognize the signs. When she remained silent, he added, most people out here are. After a long moment, she said, we all have reasons for the choices we make, Mr. Mackenzie. Some are best left unexamined. Vincent, he said suddenly, my name is Vincent. She turned to face him fully, something vulnerable in her expression. Vincent, she repeated softly, testing the name, and I'm Abigail. At least when I'm not being Miss Hayes. The sound of her given name on his lips felt like crossing an invisible boundary. Abigail, he said, would you do me the honor of a dance? Her eyes widened in surprise. You dance? Poorly, he admitted with a half-smile, but I'd like to try with you. The musicians had begun a waltz, the sweet strains carrying across the square. Abigail hesitated, then nodded. I'd like that too. Vincent led her back toward the dancing area, where several couples already moved in time to the music. He was acutely aware of his limitations as a dancer. It had been years since he'd attempted anything more formal than an occasional two-step in some frontier saloon. But when he placed his hand at Abigail's waist and took her gloved hand in his, something clicked into place. They moved together with surprising ease, her light steps complementing his more deliberate ones. You dance better than you claimed, she said, a smile playing at her lips. Good partner, he replied simply. As they circled the makeshift dance floor, Vincent was conscious of curious glances from townspeople. The reserved cowboy and the proper schoolteacher, an unlikely pair in many eyes. Yet in that moment, with Abigail's hand in his and her eyes meeting his without reservation, Vincent felt a sense of rightness he hadn't experienced in years. The music ended too soon. As they stepped apart, Vincent noticed a flush on Abigail's cheeks that matched the warmth he felt in his own face. Thank you for the dance, she said formally, though her eyes conveyed something more personal. The pleasure was mine, he replied, meaning it more sincerely than any words he'd spoken in recent memory. A crack of thunder, much closer now, interrupted the moment. Dark clouds had moved in while they danced, and fat raindrops began to fall, sending festival-goers scrambling for shelter. Let me see you home, Vincent offered as people rushed to gather their belongings. Abigail nodded and they hurried toward the schoolhouse as the rain intensified. By the time they reached the covered porch, both were considerably dampened. Would you like to come in until the worst passes? Abigail asked, fumbling with her key as lightning flashed overhead. Vincent hesitated, aware of the impropriety of entering her home alone, even with innocent intentions. But as thunder boomed directly overhead and the rain became a deluge, practical concerns won out over social convention. Thank you, he said, following her inside. The schoolroom was dark save for the occasional flash of lightning through the windows. Abigail moved confidently through the familiar space, lighting a lamp that cast a warm glow over the neat rows of desks. I'll make some tea, she offered. The stove upstairs should still be warm. Vincent followed her up the narrow staircase to her private quarters. The small apartment was simply but comfortably furnished. A sofa and reading chair near the stove, a small table with 2 chairs, and doors leading presumably to a bedroom and kitchen area. Books lined every available shelf, and a vase of wildflowers brightened the table. Please sit, Abigail said, gesturing to the sofa as she removed her damp shawl. I'll just be a moment. While she busied herself in the kitchen area, Vincent took the opportunity to observe the personal space of the woman who had increasingly occupied his thoughts. The room revealed little he didn't already know or suspect: a love of books and music, simple but refined tastes, an appreciation for the natural beauty of the frontier in the carefully preserved wildflowers and pine boughs decorating the space. Only one item seemed out of place: a small, ornate silver frame on the mantel, turned face down rather than displayed. Vincent's curiosity was piqued, but he remained seated, respecting her privacy. Abigail returned with a tray bearing a teapot and 2 cups. "I'm afraid I have no whiskey to offer, unlike most frontier homes," she said with a small smile. "Tea is perfect," Vincent replied. "Thank you for the shelter." As she poured the steaming liquid, Vincent noticed a slight tremor in her hands. Nervousness at having a man in her private quarters, perhaps, or something else. The same instinct that had served him well in tracking cattle and reading weather patterns told him something was amiss. "Is everything all right?" he asked quietly. Abigail looked up, surprise in her green eyes. "Yes, of course." "Why do you ask? You seem uneasy." She handed him a cup, her composure regained. "It's not every day I entertain visitors here. The town might talk." "We can leave the door open," Vincent suggested. "Propriety served, even if we get a bit wet." A genuine smile eased the tension in her face. "I'm not overly concerned with gossip, to be honest, but thank you for the consideration." They sipped their tea as the storm raged outside, conversation turning to safer topics: the success of the festival, the progress of her students, the prospects for winter weather. Yet beneath the pleasant exchange, Vincent sensed Abigail's guardedness had returned. The openness they'd shared during their dance had receded, replaced by careful politeness. As the thunder moved off into the distance and the rain lessened to a steady patter, Vincent set down his empty cup. "I should go before it gets too late. Thank you for the tea." Abigail nodded, walking him to the door. At the top of the stairs, Vincent paused, turning to face her. "Abigail," he said softly, testing her name again, "I enjoyed this evening." Something flickered in her eyes, longing, perhaps, quickly masked by caution. "So did I, Vincent." Impulsively, he reached for her hand, bringing it briefly to his lips in a gesture that surprised them both. "Good night." Her fingers tightened on his for a moment before withdrawing. "Good night. Be safe on the ride back." As Vincent descended the stairs and exited into the rain-washed night, his mind was in turmoil. Something was happening between them, something he hadn't sought or expected, but which now seemed as inevitable as the changing seasons. Abigail Hayes was becoming important to him in ways he hadn't allowed anyone to be in years. And that, Vincent realized as he mounted Starlight and turned toward the Double Creek, was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. Because caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant the potential for loss, a risk he'd long ago promised himself he would never take again. Yet as he rode through the night, the memory of Abigail's face in the lamplight stayed with him, challenging everything he'd believed about his capacity for attachment. For the first time in years, Vincent found himself considering a future that included someone else, specifically, a honey-haired schoolteacher with secrets in her eyes and unexpected courage in her heart. The first snow of the season fell in early November, transforming Clearwater overnight into a winter wonderland. Abigail woke to find the world outside her window draped in white, the familiar landscape rendered new and magical by the pristine covering. Despite the cold that seeped through the schoolhouse's thin walls, she felt a childlike delight at the beauty of it. School attendance dropped sharply as the weather worsened. Children from outlying ranches and farms could no longer make the journey safely, leaving Abigail with only the town children in her classroom. She used the smaller numbers to advantage, providing more individual attention and advancing the remaining students more quickly through their lessons. In the evenings, she wrote detailed lesson plans for those unable to attend, sending them home with siblings or neighbors when possible. The work kept her busy and her mind occupied, a blessing, as it left less time for dwelling on thoughts of Vincent Mackenzie. Since the Harvest Festival and their unexpected evening together, Abigail had seen him only twice, once at church and once at the general store. Both encounters had been brief, public, and tinged with an unspoken awareness that something had shifted between them. His gaze held questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Her responses remained carefully measured. It was better this way, Abigail told herself firmly as she corrected arithmetic exercises by lamplight. Any deeper connection would inevitably lead to revelations she couldn't afford. Vincent was perceptive and direct, qualities she admired but which made him dangerous to her carefully constructed new life. A knock at the schoolhouse door startled her from her thoughts. Visitors were rare in the evening, especially in such weather. Abigail set down her pen and descended the stairs cautiously, lamp in hand. "Who is it?" she called through the door. "Vincent Mackenzie," came the reply, muffled by the thick wood. "Apologies for the late hour." Abigail's heart quickened as she unbolted the door. Vincent stood on the porch, snow dusting his shoulders and hat, his face ruddy from the cold. "Mr. Mackenzie," she said formally, aware that even with the door open, receiving a man alone at night would raise eyebrows if observed. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," he assured her. "I was in town delivering a message to the telegraph office and thought I'd check that you have enough firewood. The storm's expected to worsen overnight." The consideration touched her. "That's very kind. I believe I'm well supplied, but please, come in from the cold for a moment." Vincent stepped inside, removing his hat and stomping snow from his boots. In the lamplight, Abigail could see fatigue etched in his features. "You look exhausted," she observed. "Have you been riding long in this weather?" "Since dawn," he admitted. "The cattle needed moving to the sheltered pasture before the worst of the snow." "You should rest before returning to the ranch," Abigail said, concern overriding her usual caution. "The schoolroom is warm at least." Vincent followed her into the classroom, where the pot-bellied stove radiated welcome heat. He moved toward it gratefully, extending his hands to the warmth. "The children who made it to school today were too excited by the snow to concentrate," Abigail said, filling the silence. "We ended up having an impromptu geography lesson on regions that receive heavy snowfall." Vincent smiled slightly. "Making the best of the distraction, clever teaching." "One adapts," Abigail hesitated, then asked, "Have you had supper? I was about to prepare something simple for myself." The invitation surprised them both. Vincent studied her face for a moment before responding, "I wouldn't want to impose." "It's no imposition, just soup and bread, nothing elaborate." Abigail found herself hoping he would accept, despite her earlier resolution to maintain distance. "Then thank you, I'd appreciate it." Upstairs in her small kitchen, Abigail busied herself heating the vegetable soup she'd prepared the previous day. Vincent stood awkwardly in the doorway, clearly uncertain of his place in the domestic space. "You can hang your coat by the stove to dry," she suggested, nodding toward the sitting area. As he did so, Abigail stole glances at him from the kitchen. Without his heavy coat, Vincent's athletic build was more apparent, broad shoulders tapering to a narrow waist, strength evident in the way he moved. He'd clearly cleaned up before coming to town, his dark hair still damp from washing, his face freshly shaven. When the soup was hot, they sat at her small table. For a time they ate in companionable silence, the howling wind outside making the warmth of the apartment seem all the more precious. "Do you miss Boston during winter?" Vincent asked eventually. Abigail considered the question. Sometimes. Winter there had its own beauty, gaslights reflecting on snow, skating on the common, concerts and lectures to occupy the long evenings. She smiled ruefully. "But I don't miss the social obligations." Winter was the height of the season, with endless calls and parties. "You didn't enjoy them." "Some yes, but there was always such scrutiny. Every word, every gesture analyzed for hidden meaning." Abigail stirred her soup thoughtfully. "Here, life is harder in many ways, but simpler in others, more honest." Vincent nodded in understanding. "The frontier strips away pretense. For better or worse, you face the truth of who you are." His words struck uncomfortably close to Abigail's deepest thoughts. She had come west partly to escape judgment, yet also to discover who she might be beyond the labels Boston society had assigned her. "Ruined woman, fallen daughter, unfit mother. And has the frontier revealed your truth, Mr. Mackenzie?" she asked softly. He met her gaze steadily. "Parts of it, others I'm still discovering." He paused, then added, "Vincent, please. After sharing a dance and 2 meals, I think we've earned the right to first names." "Vincent," she conceded with a small smile. "And yes, I'm Abigail, not Miss Hayes, within these walls at least." As they finished their meal, the conversation turned to lighter topics, books they had read, places they had seen, humorous incidents with students or cattle. Abigail found herself laughing more freely than she had in months, drawn by Vincent's dry wit and thoughtful observations. "You should do that more often," he said suddenly. "Do what?" "Laugh like that." Without restraint, his blue eyes held hers. "Your whole face transforms." The unexpected compliment warmed her more than the soup or fire had done. Teaching requires a certain decorum, she said, trying to mask her pleasure at his words. Does it? The children might learn more from a teacher who laughs freely. Perhaps, though I doubt the town council would agree. Vincent helped her clear the dishes, their movements in the small kitchen requiring a careful dance to avoid collision. The domestic intimacy of the task brought a flush to Abigail's cheeks. This was dangerous territory, not just the potential for gossip, but the growing comfort she felt in his presence. As Vincent dried the last plate, his gaze fell on the mantel and the silver frame still lying face down. Abigail followed his eyes, tensing involuntarily. "Family portrait?" he asked casually. "Something like that," she replied, taking the plate and returning it to the cupboard. "From another life." Vincent didn't press, but Abigail could feel his curiosity. The silver frame contained the only image she possessed of her infant son, taken the day he was born, before he was whisked away to his new family. She kept it face down when not alone. The pain of looking at it was private, not for sharing, yet she couldn't bear to hide it away completely. The clock on the mantel chimed 8, breaking the tension of the moment. "I should go," Vincent said. "The snow will make for slow riding." "Is it safe to travel in this weather?" Abigail asked, moving to the window. The snow was falling heavily now, visibility reduced to a few yards. Vincent joined her, frowning at the worsening conditions. "I've ridden in worse. Starlight knows the way." "That seems unnecessarily risky," Abigail said before she could stop herself. "The Petersons have a spare room they let to travelers. Surely it would be wiser to stay in town tonight." "Are you concerned for my welfare, Abigail?" There was a teasing note in his voice, but his eyes were serious. "I would be concerned for anyone attempting that ride in such conditions," she replied primly, though they both recognized the evasion. Vincent considered the window again, then nodded. "Perhaps you're right, the Petersons' place it is." Abigail walked him to the door, suddenly reluctant to see him go despite the propriety of his departure. At the threshold, Vincent turned to face her, his expression softening in the lamplight. "Thank you for the meal and company," he said. "Both were unexpected pleasures." "You're welcome any time," Abigail replied, surprising herself with the sincerity of the invitation. Vincent hesitated, then reached out to lightly touch her cheek with the back of his fingers, a gesture so gentle it made her breath catch. "Good night, Abigail." Before she could respond, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Abigail stood motionless, her cheeks still warm from his touch, her mind and heart in turmoil. This was precisely what she'd feared and tried to avoid, the growing attachment between them. Vincent Mackenzie was becoming important to her in ways that threatened everything she'd sacrificed to build her new life. If he discovered her past, his good opinion, which she now valued more than she cared to admit, would be lost forever. Yet as she climbed the stairs to her empty apartment, Abigail couldn't bring herself to regret the evening. For a few precious hours, she had experienced the simple pleasure of connection without pretense or fear. A taste of what life might be like if her past didn't stand as an insurmountable barrier between her and the possibility of happiness. The thought followed her into dreams, bittersweet visions of a future that could never be. The following weeks brought more snow and bitter cold to Clearwater. The town settled into the familiar rhythm of winter isolation, with social activities moving indoors and travel between ranches and town becoming an exercise in endurance rather than convenience. Vincent found reasons to visit Clearwater more frequently than the ranch business strictly required. Each time he made a point of stopping by the schoolhouse, often bearing small gifts, a book he thought Abigail might enjoy, pine branches to brighten her rooms, or once, a length of bright blue ribbon he'd purchased in Helena during a cattle sale. These visits remained proper on the surface, brief exchanges on the schoolhouse porch or conversations in the classroom while students worked on assignments. Yet beneath the formality, something deeper was developing, evident in shared glances and the increasing ease of their conversations. Vincent was aware he was courting Abigail, though neither had acknowledged it explicitly. The realization had come to him during the long ride back to the ranch after their supper together during the first snowstorm. He had spent years carefully avoiding attachments, convinced that the frontier was no place for emotional entanglements. Loss and grief were inevitable companions to love in a land where survival itself was often in question. Yet Abigail had somehow breached the walls he'd built around his heart. Her courage, intelligence, and the vulnerability she tried so hard to conceal drew him like a moth to flame. For the first time since burying his parents, Vincent found himself thinking about a future that included someone else. But Abigail remained guarded in certain ways. She spoke freely of her teaching, her students, her observations of frontier life, but rarely of her past in Boston. When conversation turned to family or her reasons for coming west, she deflected with practiced skill. Vincent recognized the signs of someone protecting secrets. He carried enough of his own to know the pattern. Whatever ghosts haunted Abigail Hayes, they were hers to reveal when and if she chose. Vincent had decided he could accept that, even as his feelings for her deepened. The frontier offered second chances to those willing to work for them. Everyone deserved the opportunity to build a new life without the burden of past mistakes. These thoughts occupied him as he rode toward Clearwater on a clear December morning, a week before Christmas. The Double Creek's owner had given him the day to handle personal business in town, a transparent excuse they both understood was related to the schoolteacher who had captured Vincent's interest. The town looked festive despite the harsh weather, with pine boughs decorating storefronts and red ribbons adorning the church door. Vincent secured starlight outside the general store and proceeded first to conduct his legitimate errands, purchasing supplies, checking mail, arranging for the delivery of ranch equipment expected on the next freight wagon. His business concluded, Vincent made his way toward the schoolhouse, anticipation quickening his steps. He had purchased a small gift for Abigail, a leather-bound volume of Tennyson's poetry he'd found in Helena on his last trip. It was an extravagance, but one he hoped would please her. As he approached the schoolhouse, Vincent noticed an unfamiliar carriage parked outside, a handsome vehicle with Eastern styling, clearly expensive and out of place in the frontier town. The sight triggered an instinctive wariness. Visitors from the East rarely brought good news to those who had sought refuge in the territories. Vincent slowed his pace, observing as the schoolhouse door opened. A well-dressed couple emerged, the woman in a fur-trimmed cloak that screamed Boston wealth, the man in a tailored overcoat and top hat. Their bearing and attire marked them as distinctly out of place in Clearwater. Behind them came Abigail, her face pale and strained in a way Vincent had never seen before. She spoke to the couple briefly, her posture rigid with tension. Though too distant to hear the exchange, Vincent could read the body language clearly enough. Abigail was deeply disturbed by these visitors. The couple climbed into their carriage, the man casting a final assessing look at Abigail before they departed. Vincent waited until the vehicle had turned onto the main street before approaching the schoolhouse, concern overriding his usual caution. Abigail stood motionless on the porch, watching the departing carriage with an expression that combined fear, anger, and profound sadness. When she noticed Vincent, she visibly startled, quickly composing her features. "Vincent," she said, her voice admirably steady despite her obvious distress. "I didn't expect you today." "I had business in town," he replied, studying her face closely. "Is everything all right? Those visitors seem to upset you." "Former acquaintances from Boston," she said with forced lightness. "Passing through on their way to Helena, nothing important." The lie was so transparent that Vincent almost called her on it immediately. Instead, he gestured to the schoolhouse door. "May I come in for a moment?" "I have something for you." Abigail hesitated, then nodded. "Of course. The children have gone home early for the day. Christmas excitement makes learning difficult." Inside, the classroom showed evidence of holiday preparations. Paper decorations hung from the ceiling, and a small evergreen stood in one corner, adorned with simple ornaments clearly made by students. Under normal circumstances, Vincent would have commented on these touches, but Abigail's distress was too apparent to ignore. "Who were they really?" he asked quietly when the door closed behind them. Abigail moved to her desk, placing physical distance between them. "As I said, acquaintances from my past. Their visit was unexpected but not significant." "Abigail," Vincent kept his voice gentle but firm. "I've never seen you look as you did when they left. Whatever they wanted clearly upset you deeply." She turned away, busying herself with papers on her desk. "You're imagining things." "I'm perfectly fine." Vincent approached slowly, giving her space while making it clear he wasn't accepting the evasion. "I respect your privacy, you know that, but if you're in some kind of trouble, I'd like to help." Abigail's shoulders tensed, then sagged slightly. When she turned to face him, her green eyes held a mixture of wariness and resignation. "They're from my past," she admitted. "A past I came west to leave behind. Their appearance here is complicated." "Are they a danger to you?" Vincent asked, protective instinct rising. not in the way you're thinking." Abigail's fingers worried at the edge of a paper on her desk. "They represent complications I hope to avoid by coming to Montana." Vincent nodded, accepting the limited explanation for now. "If you need anything at all, you only have to ask. I hope you know that." Gratitude flickered in her eyes. "Thank you, but this is something I must handle myself." Recognizing that pressing further would only cause her to retreat, Vincent changed the subject. "I brought you an early Christmas gift, if you'll accept it." The tension eased slightly from Abigail's posture. "That's very kind." Vincent produced the wrapped book from his coat pocket. "It's nothing elaborate, but when I saw it, I thought of you." Abigail accepted the package, carefully unwrapping the brown paper to reveal the volume of poetry. Her fingers traced the embossed leather binding with appreciation. "Tennyson," she murmured, "one of my favorites. Thank you, Vincent, it's beautiful." "There's an inscription," he said, suddenly feeling oddly vulnerable. Abigail opened the cover to find Vincent's neat handwriting on the flyleaf. "To Abigail, may these words bring comfort when the frontier seems harsh and companionship when solitude weighs heavy. Yours, Vincent." She looked up, her eyes bright with emotion. "I'll treasure this." The moment stretched between them, fragile and charged with unspoken feelings. Vincent wanted nothing more than to close the distance between them, to offer comfort against whatever shadows had been stirred by the Boston visitors. But Abigail's posture still held a warning, a plea for space he felt compelled to honor. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "The ranch hands are expecting me back before dark." Abigail nodded, clutching the book to her chest like a shield. "Thank you again for the gift, it was thoughtful." At the door, Vincent paused. "The church is having a Christmas Eve service. I thought perhaps, if you'd like company, we might attend together." A small, genuine smile finally softened her features. "I'd like that very much." "Then I'll call for you at 6 on Christmas Eve." Vincent touched his hat. "Take care, Abigail." As he descended the schoolhouse steps, Vincent cast a final glance back at the building. Through the window, he could see Abigail standing exactly where he'd left her, the book still clutched to her chest, her expression troubled and distant. Whatever storm the Boston visitors had brought to her doorstep, Vincent resolved to be a source of stability in its wake. He had seen something in Abigail's eyes that went beyond simple distress, a profound fear of loss that resonated with his own deepest wounds. For the first time in years, Vincent found himself caring about someone's pain as deeply as he'd once cared about his own. The realization was both terrifying and strangely liberating. Whatever secrets Abigail harbored, they didn't change the essential truth that had been growing in his heart for months. He was falling in love with her. As he mounted Starlight for the long ride back to the Double Creek, Vincent wondered if Abigail might someday trust him enough to share the burden that clearly weighed on her. Until then, he would offer what she seemed to need most: unwavering support and the freedom to reveal her past in her own time. The Boston visitors had shattered Abigail's carefully constructed peace. As she watched Vincent ride away from the schoolhouse, the weight of what had transpired earlier threatened to overwhelm her. Mr. and Mrs. Edward Cunningham, the wealthy couple who had adopted her infant son 18 months earlier, had tracked her to Clearwater. Their unexpected appearance at the schoolhouse door had been like a visitation from ghosts, bringing the past she'd tried so desperately to outrun directly to her frontier sanctuary. "We were quite surprised to discover your whereabouts, Miss Hayes, Mrs. Cunningham had said, her cultured voice at odds with the rough schoolroom. "Boston society believes you to be teaching at a girls' seminary in Philadelphia." "That was the arrangement," Abigail had replied, struggling to maintain her composure. "May I ask why you've come all this way?" Mr. Cunningham, a stern-faced man in his 40s, had studied her with cold assessment. "To ensure your continued discretion, naturally. We've established ourselves as the child's parents in Boston society. Any complications would be most unwelcome." The implication had been clear. They feared she might attempt to reclaim her son or somehow disrupt their perfect family narrative. "I signed legal documents relinquishing all rights," Abigail had reminded them, anger briefly overcoming her shock. "I have respected our arrangement completely." "Indeed," Mrs. Cunningham had conceded. "However, when we learned you had left Philadelphia, we became concerned. A mother's attachment can sometimes overcome better judgment." The casual cruelty of the statement had pierced Abigail deeply. These people who were raising her child as their own saw her only as a potential threat to their social standing, not as a young woman who had made an agonizing sacrifice for her baby's welfare. "I assure you I have no intention of disrupting your lives," Abigail had said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "I came west to build a new life for myself, nothing more." Mr. Cunningham had nodded, satisfied. "Excellent. Then we understand each other. We're prepared to provide additional financial compensation for your continued silence." The offer of money, as if her absence from her child's life could be purchased, had been the final insult. Abigail had declined with as much dignity as she could muster, showing them politely but firmly to the door just as Vincent had appeared. Now, alone in the schoolroom, Abigail sank into her chair, the beautiful volume of Tennyson still clutched in her hands. The contrast between the Cunninghams' cold calculation and Vincent's thoughtful gift brought tears to her eyes. One represented everything she had lost, the other, possibilities she could never allow herself to pursue. For Vincent was clearly developing feelings for her, feelings she found herself returning despite her best efforts to maintain distance. His inscription in the book, the invitation to attend Christmas Eve service together, the concern in his eyes when he sensed her distress, all pointed to a deepening attachment that both thrilled and terrified her. If Vincent knew the truth, that she had borne a child out of wedlock, had given him away rather than face life as an unwed mother, would he still look at her with that warmth in his blue eyes? Would he still bring her thoughtful gifts and worry about her well-being, or would she see the same judgment and disappointment she had faced in Boston? The Cunninghams' visit had made one thing painfully clear: her past could find her anywhere. The careful story she had constructed in Clearwater, the respectable schoolteacher seeking adventure in the West, was ultimately built on sand. One revelation could wash it all away. And yet, as Abigail opened the volume of poetry and read Vincent's inscription again, a small, defiant hope flickered in her heart. The frontier was different from Boston. People here judged less by social convention and more by character and action. She had proven herself to Clearwater through her teaching and her courage at the mill fire. Would that count for nothing if her secret were revealed?